On May 25th, 2020, George Floyd died after an altercation with police that ended up with Derek Chauvin kneeling on his neck and back for over 9 minutes. Protests, riots, and demonstration after demonstration sprang up almost immediately, and after that summer, America was never the same. Or was it? We're now 1 year out from the death of George Floyd, and there's been lots of debate on what should or shouldn't change. But in terms of policy, laws, and reform, what has actually changed over the year, and what hasn't? Well, the biggest change that's been proposed on a national scale has been H.R. 7120, or the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. Among the many changes this bill would introduce are increased accountability for law enforcement misconduct, restricting the use of certain policing practices, making it easier to convict a law enforcement officer for misconduct, and establishing a framework to prevent and remedy racial profiling by law enforcement at the federal, state, and local levels. It would also limit the unnecessary use of force and restrict the use of no-knock warrants, chokeholds, and carotid holds, in addition to creating a national registry to compile data on complaints and records of police misconduct, and establishing new reporting requirements on the use of force, officer misconduct, and routine practices like stops and searches. Now, if you're like me and thought all of this sounded suspiciously too good to be true, well, that's because, at least at the time of this filming, it kind of is. The bill didn't advance to the Senate in 2020, and though it was reintroduced in 2021 and passed the House, it hasn't gone to the Senate yet or to Biden for approval. I shouldn't even have to disclose that it was the GOP's fault this is stuck in gridlock, but just for full disclosure, it was totally the GOP's fault. Biden has been very vocal about wanting something on his desk to sign by the anniversary of Floyd's death, which, clock's ticking, Congress. One specific holdup is that the bill wants to diminish the power of something called qualified immunity, which is a system that makes it difficult for people to sue killer cops, or cops who injure you or your property. Ah yes, because suing a cop who wrongly shot you or even killed a family member is just too unreasonable. And I actually find it almost impossible to imagine a scenario with a bunch of people successfully suing the police when we as a country cheered when one cop was convicted, the same day 16-year-old Ma'Khia Bryant was justifiably shot and killed by one. So, what has changed? Well, some cities and states have banned chokeholds, something people have been calling for since the death of Eric Garner way back in 2014. Connecticut, New York, California, and others banned the controversial practice, as well as cities such as Houston, Minneapolis, Chicago, and Raleigh. Oh, and also in France, which I don't know if that was an issue there, but I can imagine they took one look at America, went yikes, and passed the law. And more reform is at least on the table, such as California's Assembly Bill 26, introduced by Pasadena Assemblyman Chris Holden, which would require police officers to intervene when another officer is using excessive force. Holden calls it the George Floyd law because Derek Chauvin's fellow officers did nothing as Floyd was dying. However, the section of the bill that would have made it a crime for fellow officers to not report on excessive force was removed. So that's what they mean by blue wall of silence. But a lot hasn't changed. Chokeholds are still legal in many places. Nationally, officers aren't required to intervene when another officer is out of line, and we don't have a national registry for violent police, which enables them to hop from job to job and actually continue the cycle of racism and abuse. Another key part of policing that has seen little national reform has been Terry stops. Terry stops, which should really be listed on the underside of that iceberg of white supremacy image, are when police are able to pull people over for a reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, which is officially a lower standard than probable cause, which is already a murky and controversial subject. A popular form of Terry stop is called a pretextual stop, where they use the pretext of little enforced minor infractions to then perform random searches in the hope of finding something criminal. Named after a Supreme Court case from 1968 during the height of the Civil Rights era, which should tell you something, Terry stops have led to notable deaths, such as Philando Castile, who was shot and killed with his girlfriend and 4-year-old daughter in the car with him. A quote from the officer that led to the stop: "The driver looks more like one of our suspects, just because of the wide-set nose," which is one of the most blatantly racist dog whistles I've ever heard. Or let's take the infamous Sandra Bland case, where the cop began following Bland so closely that she changed lanes to give him the right of way, at which point he pulled her over for failure to signal a lane change. 3 days later, and she's dead in a jail cell, ruled a suicide. So it's quite clear that America has a long, long way to go in terms of police-based violence, and you could say that little has actually changed in the year after George Floyd in terms of policy and lessening the police's role in systemic racism. But what do you think? Should the police be defunded, even abolished? Or if not, what form of actual police reform should we even take, assuming we ever even get it? Me, I'm predicting more small victories getting headlines in between continually deadlocked Congress and extremely powerful police unions. But hey, prove me wrong. Please.